Hey everybody, we're the good doctors of Abbey Research. I'm Dr. Erin.
I'm Dr. Kristen.
You are all very welcome to our YouTube channel. We are PhDs in social science, and we love talking about and studying and exploring cultures, both lived and popular. We are educators who practice talking about empathy and inclusivity through a whole host of diverse conversations, from systemic racism to the romantic tropes in Bridgerton to sex abuse cases and our hot ish takes videos, links below, to all of the other playlists that we have on this YouTube channel. But we love having conversations and engaging with people. So make sure that you like and subscribe and follow along. Join the chat below in the comments because we love to talk to people about all of these things. The things that we are here for today is our Colonizers World Tour series, where every week we have picked a different nation and culture to look at their history with colonialism, how it has shaped how they shape their culture and how they engage in the world. Today, we are talking about Korea because this month we are focusing on nations that were not colonized by Europe, kind of get those out of the way before we jump around all the European colonies. And today we're talking about Korea. Dr. Kristen, before we did this quick but deep dive into the Korean Peninsula, what did you know?
I knew about K-pop-ish.
Ish.
I knew that kimchi is very important.
Oh, good one.
And I knew that a lot, like every time I've eaten Korean food, an egg has been involved somehow. That's whether that's typical or not, it's just happened every time I've eaten bibimbap. There's been a
level of specificity in that statement.
There's been an egg involved.
I liked it. And
I like Korean food. That's the other thing I knew. But yeah, and I mean, like the same thing every American knows. Like we know, we know
the North Korea
division. Like I have an uncle that fought in Korea. Like that kind of stuff. But like,
I knew
2 uncles actually.
Ooh, I knew there was a Korean War.
Yeah, for sure.
And that the United States was involved in it.
I knew that MASH was set during the Korean War.
I did know that.
I did know that
because everyone thinks it's Vietnam, but it's not. It's Korea.
It's Korea. Yeah.
I haven't watched the Ken Burns style documentary about the Korean War yet, so I don't know a whole lot about it. But I know our involvement in it was sketchy, like our involvement in most wars. And I knew about K-pop-ish, but I've kind of opened the fire hydrant of K-pop in the last few days. I knew BTS existed. I knew they were all very pretty young men. And that was really about it. I
knew Korean skincare is like world renowned as being amazing.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, you can order Korean skincare masks on Amazon, and it has been very recommended many times to me. When I went to Japan, I was told to buy Japanese and Korean products, as many as I could. So
cool.
Yeah.
All right. So that is what we knew, which wasn't a whole lot, as you just heard. Here's what we have learned in real brief demographic terms. Obviously, there is the Korean Peninsula, made up by the Democratic Republic of North Korea and South Korea. It is bordered at the top by China and then on the sides by various seas. The population in the south is about 52 million humans. The population in North Korea is about roughly half of that, 26 million. The capitals in South Korea is Seoul, in North Korea, Pyongyang. There is a lot of Korean cultural homogeneity. So there's not a lot of ethnic diversity in terms of groups. It's 97% Korean. That means the language spoken is Korean, although Korean does have some affinity to Japanese and some loan words from China as well. The currency is the Korean won in the South and the North Korean People's won, because they've got to be special. The system of government, fascinating that I learned, this was one of my favorite tidbits, but not the favorite, which we'll get to. The instituted government in South Korea after 1997 is based on the United States system of representative democracy, with a sharing of powers between the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature. And then administratively, there are 9 provinces in South Korea that divided up the governing in that way. North Korea is a communist totalitarian dictatorship, but they call themselves a revolutionary and socialist state that was founded in 1948. So we have a little bit of religious history coming from our religious scholar, Dr. Kristen. Hit me.
Yeah, so these videos will always cover religion, gender, and sexuality because those are kind of our bailiwicks in a way.
So what we're most interested in.
The religion stuff is really fascinating to me because there is not a state religion.
I was surprised.
So the culture is very, very influenced by Confucianism and the principles of Buddhism. However, evangelical Protestant Christianity is major in South Korea, which did not come up in some of the stuff. And I like every time it wasn't talked about, I was like, but evangelicals are huge in South Korea. Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah,
so,
and
like,
a couple of the stuff I watched just talked about like Protestant denominations, and I was like, why aren't they saying the E word? Why aren't they saying evangelical? So that was really interesting. I didn't even recognize that it was left out, but it totally was.
Yeah, and there's some very evangelical stuff, like, but the largest, like, one of the largest Baptist churches in the world is in South Korea. The Presbyterian churches, Protestant Christianity is very baked into a lot of modern Korean life because missionaries came. I could probably talk at length about the particular intersections of American missionary life and South Korea, and if that is something people are interested in, please let me know, because I haven't found a video on that, so I'm happy to make one. But in the links below, there's a lot of other stuff. In terms of sexuality, just real briefly, while same-sex activity is legal, same-sex partnerships and marriage are definitely not. It is seemingly less difficult for transgender people to switch their gender on official documentation. But from stories that I have read, all of this stuff happens very much on the QT in the culture. It's not very at least in most places, it's not very out and about in terms of how you engage with your gender and sexuality if they are not of the norm.
Yeah, and what I found interesting about North Korea specifically was that it's not technically not illegal, but homosexuality violates morality and decency clause.
Ooh.
So they haven't outlawed specifically homosexuality.
It's like how evangelical colleges get around it.
Yeah, but so they have this weird workaround that they're like, we're
interesting.
Not gonna make it illegal, but we are going to say that it is illegal because it violates morality and decency clause, which I thought was a tricky little but interesting distinction.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So there's a lot to learn about Korea. We definitely focused a little bit more on South Korea ourselves, but I know when I have free time again, where we're not jaunting around the world, I will be doing a much deeper dive into Korea and the split and how it was the Chinese vassal state, particularly how the South Korean government grew the economy through family business at one point. As a family business owner, that was fascinating to me. Like, Hyundai is a family business at its core. Okay, sure. Didn't know.
I saw a Hyundai advertisement this weekend, and I thought of that because you told me last week, and I was like, oh, I did not know.
So that kind of relationship is really fascinating. We're going to be focusing, like we said, this week on K-pop, specifically Blackpink and BTS. But my favorite thing that I learned in terms of kind of the, I don't know, interesting tidbit is that Korea was really afraid of the opioid trade that was making everyone a ton of money throughout the 1800s. They isolated themselves for a while before they became a vassal state of China because they were afraid of opium taking over their people. So I look at the opioid epidemic in the United States a lot, and there was a lot of faff around how opioids couldn't be addictive or whatever. And in the 1800s, the Korean people were like, no, that stuff is trouble. Doesn't matter how much money comes in. That stuff is trouble. Fascinating.
Yeah. A couple of tidbits that I enjoyed learning about that I did not know, specifically about South Korea, was the influence of the Japanese government and Japanese culture. But like Japan annexed, occupied, took over Korea in 1910, and that relationship was severed after the Second World War. And so there's a huge influence of Japanese culture in Korea. But also I was fascinated to learn that they were heavily involved in like creating the administrative governmental systems, transportation, cinema. Japanese cinema had a huge influence on the development of Korean culture in the 20th century. So I found that really fascinating. The other thing, I read an article in the BBC, and I'll make sure that it's in the show notes, about what they called the population conundrum happening in South Korea. It is a booming economy globally, but they're having a problem with population growth because they have an aging population with a very high life expectancy. It's 10 years above the global average. So people are living longer, but they have an older population, but their birth rate is below the replication rate, which means like in order to keep up with population, you have to have a certain level of like replication, and South Korea is well below that. So they have the lowest fertility rate in the country, in the world, and they're also, their young people are not getting married and not having kids. So they're facing this like, we have this huge economy, but like who's going to take care of it if we don't produce the kids? Which I thought was a really interesting, and I'd love to dig more into why that is happening specifically in South Korea. But those were the two things of very interesting that I learned about South Korea.
Okay.
I know.
Well, we can't wait to learn more. We'll see you guys tomorrow for our discussion about Blackpink. Bye.
Excited. Bye.